Daughter marries her father, the Langston family's strange inbreeding. In the year 1820, in Beaufort County, South Carolina, amidst endless cotton fields stretching under a harsh sun, Dawnland Plantation was a symbol of prosperity and power. To the high society of Charleston, the Langston family was the epitome of wealth, refined taste, and unmatched piety. But hidden behind the glamorous facade of lavish parties and the splendid walls of the mansion lay a horrific secret, concealed for years through manipulation and deceit. When the truth was exposed in the winter of 1825, it shook the very foundations of Old South society. The case files, sealed in the Charleston courthouse archives for over a century, tell of a meticulously calculated conspiracy, of forged documents, and of a young girl turned into an instrument for an ambition so dark it defies comprehension. The scandal was so immense that the most powerful families in Charleston tried everything to expunge it from history. The local church burned its related records, and the remaining relatives of the Langstons quietly sold off their property and disappeared, taking the family's disgrace with them. But the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the light. Before we continue with the story of Clara Mayfield and the terrible secret of the Langston clan, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the darkest and most disturbing true stories from America's past. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly deep dives into history's most chilling mysteries. And let me know in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love to know where our community of mystery lovers is tuning in from across the country. The documents that survived the scandal would remain locked away in the Charleston courthouse archives until 1927, when a young historian researching antebellum land laws stumbled upon them. His notes to the South Carolina Historical Society described the contents as too abhorrent for the human conscience, and the documents were sealed once more, falling silent for another half-century. The story begins in 1810, when South Carolina was at the peak of its cotton economy and the promise of endless prosperity. Dawnland Plantation, sprawling over 4,000 acres of fertile cotton land, had been in the Langston family for 3 generations. The original land grant, signed by one of the colonial governors himself in 1750, had established the family as planter aristocracy, a position they had solidified through strategic marriages, shrewd investments in shipping, and an ironclad determination to preserve their legacy at any cost. The head of the family, Thaddeus Langston, was a man of immense influence. A former respected member of the South Carolina Legislative Council, he had resigned to focus his full energy on building his cotton empire, with trade connections stretching from Charleston to Liverpool, England. His wife, Eleanor, had died in a tragic accident, a fall from a horse, leaving him to preside over his vast estate alone. At 45, Thaddeus possessed an imposing presence that commanded respect from his business, rivals, and quiet admiration from the ladies of society. With his tall frame, meticulously trimmed salt and pepper hair, and steely blue eyes, he had the air of a man born to rule. His late wife, Eleanor, hailed from the Devereux family, one of the oldest and wealthiest Huguenot families in Charleston, with a lineage tracing back to the city's founders. Eleanor Devereux Langston had brought an enormous dowry and an unassailable social standing to their marriage, further cementing the Langston family's power among the South Carolina elite. Their union, though it ended in tragedy, had been the Charleston social event of its time, uniting 2 of the most powerful cotton empires in the state. The cotton boom of the early 19th century had created opportunities for rapid wealth for those astute enough to capitalize on market trends. Thaddeus was one of the first planters to recognize the potential of the Whitney cotton gin and invested heavily in the new technology. Unlike many conservative aristocrats who relied solely on inherited land, Thaddeus championed agricultural modernization and international trade, not out of any progressive spirit, but from cold calculation. He understood that change brought new rules, new financial channels, and opportunities for those ruthless enough to exploit them. His gambles paid off handsomely. While other plantations struggled with depleted soil and crippling loans, Thaddeus established exclusive shipping routes to the textile mills of Liverpool. When local banks faltered, he demanded payment from his partners in gold and Bank of England stock. As other aristocratic families went bankrupt, Dawnland expanded relentlessly, acquiring neighboring plantations at bargain prices, making Thaddeus one of the most powerful men in the South. But prosperity brought its own challenges. With no sons to carry on his name, Thaddeus faced the prospect of Dawnland being divided among distant relatives upon his death, a fate his grandfather, the plantation's founder, had warned against in a will still kept in the family safe. The old man had foreseen much: the power of the land, the importance of lineage, and the necessity of keeping the family estate intact at all costs. A divided estate is a ruined estate, he had written in his final instructions. Ensure that the Langston name and the Langston land remain one, whatever sacrifice this unity requires. The weight of this ancestral mandate pressed heavily on Thaddeus's mind as he plotted the future. He had considered remarrying. Indeed, many of Charleston's prestigious families had made overtures about their unmarried daughters, but Thaddeus couldn't stomach the thought of sharing power with a strong-willed woman like Eleanor. He had grown accustomed to absolute control over his domain, and the prospect of negotiating with a wife who had her own family, her own opinions on how to manage the estate, held no appeal. More worrisome was the question of loyalty. Any woman he married would bring her family's interests into the union, potentially distracting from his goal of preserving the Langston legacy. What Thaddeus needed was not a partner, but an instrument, someone utterly devoted to his vision, completely dependent on his protection, and bound to him by a tie stronger than a conventional marriage contract. It was in this context of cold calculation and familial duty that fate, or rather a deliberately orchestrated plot, brought Clara Mayfield into his life. The August rain fell in punishing sheets, lashing against the tall windows of the Dawnland mansion, heralding a stormy night that would change everything. Thaddeus sat in his mahogany-paneled study, reviewing cotton shipping contracts by the light of an elaborate silver candelabra, one of the pieces Eleanor had brought back from Europe. The room was a perfect reflection of the man, every book perfectly aligned, every document filed according to a strict system, and every wooden surface polished to a high gleam by servants who understood their master, tolerated no carelessness. The ledgers spread before him told a story of extraordinary prosperity. The cotton harvest had broken all records. New contracts with the Liverpool mills yielded profits that exceeded his most optimistic projections, and his investments in Charleston shipping firms were flourishing, making him one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. Yet, an anxiety gnawed at him. The bitter knowledge that all this wealth would dissipate if he could not secure its existence for future Langston generations. As the clock struck midnight, Amos Reed, his overseer, appeared at the doorway. Reed was a rugged man, his skin weathered by the sun, who had served the Langston family for nearly 3 decades, first under Thaddeus's father and now as his indispensable right hand. Reed's loyalty was absolute, his discretion tested, and his ability to carry out orders without asking unnecessary questions had been proven time and again. "Master Langston," Reed said, his voice unusually low, which immediately commanded Thaddeus's attention. "There's been an accident on the Savannah River. A cargo boat capsized in the storm. Looks like quality folks, sir." Thaddeus set his fountain pen down slowly. Quality folks meant responsibility, especially for a man of his standing in Beaufort County. But more importantly, it often meant opportunity. "Which part of the river?" "Just near the southern boundary of the plantation, sir, where the current is strongest. The boatman's dead, and so are the man and woman aboard." Reed shook his head. "They were swept away when she went over. No survivors. We recovered a few trunks." "No survivors at all?" "One child, sir. A girl, about 9 years old. She managed to cling to a piece of driftwood. She keeps calling for her parents, but she's in a state of shock, sir. Doesn't seem to remember much about what happened." Thaddeus's mind immediately began parsing the possibilities. The orphans of well-to-do families often presented intriguing opportunities for a man with the resources and cunning to capitalize on them. Identification, letters, documents, anything to tell us who they were. Reed's expression grew uncharacteristically guarded, a look Thaddeus recognized as a signal that there was information his overseer preferred to report privately. "Found some papers in a waterproof leather box, sir. Name's Henry Mayfield, traveling with his wife Abigail and their daughter. They were carrying a substantial amount of cash, sir. Looked to be on their way to buy a tract of land in Tennessee." The mention of cash piqued Thaddeus's interest, but it was Reed's tone that held his attention. There was something the overseer wasn't saying, something that needed to be discussed in private. "Bring the child here at once," Thaddeus ordered. "See that she's dried, fed, and given warm clothes. And Amos," he paused, his steely gaze locking with his overseer's, conveying a silent message. "We will discuss the other details of this unfortunate accident in private after the child has been tended to." What Thaddeus saw when he entered the side parlor an hour later would be forever seared into his memory. The child sat on a velvet armchair, a servant's oversized woolen cloak wrapped around her small frame. Despite the shock, there was an undeniable refinement about her. The way she held her back straight, the soft-spoken manner in which she thanked the maid for the warm tea, and the fine quality of the soaked dress now drying by the hearth. But it was her face that truly captured Thaddeus's attention. The child bore an uncanny resemblance to his late wife, Eleanor, particularly in her green eyes and the delicate line of her jaw. Her hair, once dried, was the same honey blonde as Eleanor's, and when she looked up at him with those wide, clear eyes, Thaddeus felt a jolt of recognition that nearly took his breath away. "What is your name, child?" Thaddeus asked, his voice unusually soft as he sat in the opposite chair, bringing himself to her level. "Clara Mayfield," she replied, her voice trembling but carrying the educated cadence of a well-bred family. "My parents, are they truly gone?" The overseer said there was an accident, but I was hoping. The question hung in the air, as heavy as the silence in the room. Thaddeus studied her more closely, noting not just the resemblance to Eleanor but an intelligent spark in her eyes, even through the horror of her ordeal. This was no common orphan, no anonymous merchant's child who could be easily forgotten. This was an educated, articulate child who would be missed if she simply vanished. But for now, she was utterly alone, frightened, and her fate rested entirely in his hands. "I'm afraid so, my dear," Thaddeus said gently, reaching out to place a hand on her shoulder in a feigned gesture of protection. "But you are safe now. Tomorrow, we will find a way to contact your relatives. We will find your family and make sure you are well cared for." Even as he spoke the comforting words, his mind was already turning over plans that would have made a less ambitious man shudder. Here was a child of good stock, orphaned and helpless, with family connections that seemed distant and difficult to verify. The possibilities were not just interesting, they were extraordinary. "Thank you, sir," Clara said, her innate politeness showing through her grief and exhaustion. "It is very kind of you to take me in. I don't know what would have happened if your men hadn't found me." Thaddeus's smile was warm and reassuring, concealing calculations that were anything but kind. "Think nothing of it, child. It is the duty of every Christian to help those in need, and I have a feeling that you and I will become very close indeed." That night, while Clara slept fitfully in a guest room under the care of a maid, Thaddeus met Amos Reed in the most remote of the plantation's cotton sheds, a place chosen for its privacy and the guarantee that no one could overhear. What they discussed in the sweltering darkness of the shed would set in motion a chain of events with unimaginable consequences. The first letter of inquiry that Thaddeus drafted was never sent. Instead, it was filed away in a locked iron box in his study, along with other documents that were slowly being created. These papers told a very different story from the one he related to his neighboring families and the authorities in Beaufort. Through discreet inquiries, Thaddeus learned that Clara's parents, Henry and Abigail Mayfield, were indeed new merchants from Savannah, Georgia, on their way to Tennessee to purchase land. Their relatives, if any, were in Georgia, another state where communication was slow and often took weeks by sea. More importantly, the Mayfields had no deep connections in South Carolina. This meant their social circle here was virtually non-existent, and their sudden disappearance would be easily attributed to the perils of river travel rather than foul play. Within a month of the accident, Thaddeus had constructed an elaborate deception, showcasing both his sharp intellect and his absolute lack of morality. He went before the county judge, presenting himself as Clara's sole guardian, armed with masterfully crafted forged documents. These papers claimed that her closest relatives in Georgia had died in a yellow fever outbreak just weeks before her parents' boat capsized. The timing was perfect, tragic enough to evoke sympathy, recent enough to explain why no one had heard the news. and distant enough to make verification nearly impossible. As Clara's only remaining link to civilized society, Thaddeus generously offered to adopt her, an act of charity that further bolstered his reputation as a virtuous gentleman while perfectly serving his own ends. The county judge, busy with land disputes and overwhelmed by Thaddeus's stature, approved the documents without question and formally granted him legal guardianship of Clara. The transition was slow and carefully controlled. Clara, traumatized by her loss and isolated on the vast plantation, gradually came to accept Thaddeus as her protector and benefactor. He hired a stern governess from Charleston, Mrs. Gertrude Hammond, to ensure Clara received a high-class education while completely controlling her access to the outside world. He instructed his household staff to treat her with respect, provided her with expensive dresses and books, and quietly began the process of molding her into the exact form he desired. But Thaddeus's plan required a more solid legal foundation than mere guardianship. In the winter of 1814, he made a trip to Charleston, a trip that would be decisive for his ultimate scheme. There, in the opulent offices of his private attorney, Phineas Crowley, Thaddeus made a series of legal moves that were as bold as they were diabolically clever. Crowley was a man who understood the value of discretion and the importance of not asking unnecessary questions when serving powerful clients like Thaddeus. A small man with slicked-back silver hair and the soft hands of someone who had never performed a day of physical labor, Crowley had built his reputation on resolving the complex legal affairs of South Carolina's planter aristocracy. His office was on the prestigious Broad Street, furnished with rosewood furniture and shelves filled with volumes on property, inheritance, and marriage contracts. First, Thaddeus had Crowley draw up formal adoption papers, making Clara his legal daughter and sole heir. The documents were a masterpiece of legal precision, establishing not only his paternal claim over her, but also ensuring her inheritance of the entire Dawnland plantation in the absence of any other direct heirs. To any observer, it was a noble act by a childless widower, providing a secure future for an unfortunate orphan. Second, and far more insidiously, he had Crowley prepare a peculiar marriage contract. The contract was between Thaddeus Langston of Dawnland Plantation, Beaufort County, and a young woman of suitable breeding and education to be named at a later date. The language was deliberately vague, the timeline undefined, and the identity of the future bride intentionally left blank. Crowley paid a handsome fee for his silence, and his ability to draft unusual legal instruments without question raised no objections. In the complex legal system of South Carolina, such open-ended marriage contracts, while rare, were not unheard of. Powerful men often used them to arrange business alliances or consolidate family holdings years in advance. The adoption papers were filed with the county court and became public record. The marriage contract was not. It was stored securely in Crowley's private safe, waiting for the opportune moment to be executed. As Clara grew from a young girl into a young woman in Thaddeus's tightly controlled environment, his investment in her education became almost obsessive in its detail and purpose. She learned French from a private tutor, literature and history from Mrs. Hammond, and the skills of plantation management through observation of the daily operations. She was schooled in all the social graces required of a plantation mistress, the unspoken rules of Charleston high society, and the complex business principles required to keep a massive estate profitable. To outside observers, Thaddeus was simply preparing his adopted daughter for a brilliant future. It was assumed he was grooming her to be married off to the younger son of some powerful family, or a promising young merchant who needed the Langston name to advance. His dedication to her education was seen as admirable, his fatherly affection touching, and his plans for her deeply responsible. But there were other lessons, teachings whispered so subtly that Clara was too young to recognize their deeper meaning. Thaddeus often spoke of absolute loyalty to the Langston family, of sacred bonds that transcended ordinary social rules, and of biblical precedents where families had unusual structures to serve God's higher purpose. He told her stories of the ancient patriarchs, men who entered into complex marriages to ensure the survival of their lineage through trying times. He constantly recounted the history of the Langston family, emphasizing the sacrifices previous generations had made to build and protect Dawnland. He spoke of ancestors who had shed blood to keep the land, of family members who had made hard choices for the sake of survival, and of the sacred duty each generation owed to those who came before and those who would follow. Slowly, almost invisibly, Thaddeus began to plant in Clara's mind the idea of her special role in this grand narrative. He explained that she was not just his adopted daughter, but the key to protecting everything the Langstons had built. She was intelligent enough to manage the business, beautiful enough to grace the family name, and loyal enough to place the family's interests above any personal aspirations. By 1824, when Clara was 21 and had blossomed into a striking young woman of sharp intellect, the psychological groundwork of Thaddeus's plan was nearly complete. She had been completely isolated from young men her own age. She was constantly reminded that her destiny was tied to the preservation of the Langston legacy, and she had been slowly manipulated into seeing Thaddeus not just as her father, but as the center of her world, the sole architect of her future. The final stage of the plan began in the spring of 1825, when Thaddeus informed Clara that he had received a letter from a distant cousin. This cousin wished to arrange a marriage that would unite two branches of the Langston family and ensure the plantation's survival for generations to come. The proposal, he explained, was the result of years of careful arrangement, a way to secure her future while allowing her to repay the family that had saved her. Clara's first glimpse of her future husband was a finely painted miniature portrait that Thaddeus presented to her in his study one sunny May morning. The portrait, set in an intricately carved silver frame and clearly the work of a talented artist, depicted a man who looked startlingly like Thaddeus himself. The same strong jaw, the same cold blue eyes, and the same air of quiet authority that radiated even from the small image. "His name is Edward Langston," her adoptive father explained, his voice neutral as he watched her reaction. "He is a cousin from Alabama, a man of good character and considerable means, who has built a rather successful plantation of his own there. This marriage will unite our family holdings and ensure that Dawnland remains whole for generations to come." Clara studied the portrait with growing unease, noting details that were both familiar and nonsensical. The man's attire, while expensive, was of a slightly outdated style, and his posture was formal in a way characteristic of portraits painted years earlier. Most unsettling was the uncanny resemblance to Thaddeus, so close they could have been brothers rather than distant cousins. "But what is his middle name, father?" she asked hesitantly. "I have never heard you speak of a cousin named Edward." Thaddeus's explanation was smooth and terrifying in its calculated simplicity. This cousin, he explained, was from a distant branch of the family that had moved to Alabama years ago. Edward Langston had inherited a tract of land and built it into a prosperous plantation, but he lacked the social connections and cultural refinement necessary to truly advance, things that only came with generations of established power in South Carolina. The marriage would be mutually beneficial, Thaddeus continued with the fluent rhetoric of a master manipulator. The cousin would gain a foothold in Charleston society and the business connections that came with the Langston name, while Clara would help preserve the family estate and secure a solid future for herself. Most importantly, the union would keep the family wealth from being dispersed among other distant relatives who might not share the same commitment to the Langston legacy. "But then, I would have to leave this place." "Leave you," Clara said, and Thaddeus was pleased to detect the genuine sorrow in her voice. He had carefully cultivated her emotional dependence over the years, ensuring that the prospect of separation was not just undesirable, but unbearable. "Not leave, my dear," Thaddeus replied, his tone one of gentle fatherly affection that concealed a deep, dark satisfaction. "Expand our family. This marriage has been very carefully arranged to ensure you never have to be far from those who care for you most. In fact, the agreement includes provisions for your new husband to spend a great deal of his time here, at Dawnland, helping me manage the business of both plantations." The wedding preparations began soon after, but they were unlike any wedding Clara had heard described in the rare stories of Charleston society. Instead of a grand public ceremony, which was the hallmark of the South Carolina planter aristocracy, with its long guest lists, weeks of festivities, and parties that drew hundreds of friends, family, and business associates, this was to be a private affair, held at Dawnland with only a few carefully selected witnesses. Thaddeus explained this unusual arrangement as a matter of both practicality and social grace. Interstate travel was still difficult, and the groom's family had expressed a desire for a simple ceremony that would not disrupt the complex business negotiations accompanying the marriage agreement. Furthermore, the bride's orphan status made a lavish wedding inappropriate. It would be more seemly for the ceremony to be conducted with solemnity and discretion, rather than with a display that might be seen as insensitive to her tragic past. As summer turned to autumn, Clara grew increasingly uneasy about aspects of the marriage that did not seem right. As much as she respected Thaddeus's judgment and was grateful for his care, she could not shake her misgivings. The invitations, which she was never allowed to see, had supposedly been sent to the groom's family and distant relations, but not a single letter of reply ever arrived at Dawnland. When she asked to see the acceptances or regrets from the guests, Thaddeus explained that his lawyer in Charleston was handling all correspondence on her behalf, so she would not have to be bothered with tedious details. When she asked to write to her fiancé, a perfectly reasonable desire to get to know him before the wedding, Thaddeus said he was currently traveling on business in the Western Territories and wished to maintain a traditional decorum by limiting contact before the ceremony. Such reticence, he insisted, was a sign of respect and serious intent, not of indifference. Most troubling were the legal documents that Phineas Crowley brought to Dawnland in September. Arriving from Charleston in a private carriage with leather satchels full of files, Clara was asked to sign a series of papers relating to inheritance rights, marriage settlements, and complex business covenants that would unite the two branches of the Langston family. But when she tried to read them thoroughly, both Thaddeus and Crowley reassured her that the legal language was too convoluted for an untrained mind to fully comprehend. "These are mere formalities required by South Carolina law," Crowley explained in his professional, clipped tone. "Standard documents that establish your rights both as an heiress to the Langston estate and as a bride in a marriage involving substantial properties. Your signature is necessary to make the agreements binding, but the actual terms have been carefully negotiated by your father and myself to ensure your absolute protection." One document in particular caught Clara's eye, a property deed that seemed to transfer her inheritance rights as Thaddeus's adopted daughter to someone else entirely. When she questioned this alarming provision, Thaddeus's explanation was ready and seamless. After her marriage, her legal status would change from daughter to daughter-in-law of the Langston family, and this paper merely reflected that change while ensuring her ultimate inheritance remained unaffected. But Clara was more intelligent than Thaddeus had perhaps anticipated, despite his years of careful manipulation. The education he had given her, including a basic understanding of property law, was enough for her to recognize that something was fundamentally wrong with these arrangements. The language of the documents seemed intentionally obscure. The signing of the papers felt rushed, and the explanations she received seemed designed to quell curiosity rather than provide true understanding. Late at night, in the privacy of her bedroom, she began to piece together a puzzle that, when completed, would reveal the horrifying truth of her situation. The truth began to unravel on a cool October evening when Clara made an accidental discovery that would change everything. Unable to sleep due to a vague anxiety about the wedding and her growing suspicions about Thaddeus's arrangements, she decided to go to his study for a book, assuming he had already retired for the night. The mansion was silent, save for the creaking of floorboards and the sound of wind whistling through the old oak trees outside. But the room was not empty. She found Thaddeus sitting by the light of an oil lamp, carefully studying the documents laid out neatly on his mahogany desk. The light cast shadows on the leather-bound books and the ancestral portraits lining the walls, their painted eyes seeming to pass judgment from the darkness. As she was about to speak, a sight froze the blood in her veins and caught the breath in her throat. Amidst the papers was the miniature portrait of her fiancé, Edward. But next to it, Thaddeus had placed a small mirror, positioned so that he could compare his own reflection to the painting. To her horror, she saw him subtly adjusting his collar and his expression, as if practicing to match the pose in the portrait exactly. Clara backed away silently, her heart pounding in her chest, certain Thaddeus would hear it, despite his intense focus. Her mind raced as she tried to process what she had seen. The resemblance between Thaddeus and the man in the portrait was not a coincidence. They were one and the same. But how was that possible? What explanation could there be for such an elaborate deception? The answer that formed in her mind was so monstrous, she could hardly bear to face it. Yet, it explained every illogical aspect of the wedding preparations. There was no cousin Edward. There never had been. Thaddeus intended to marry her himself, using a false identity to legitimize the union, while legally maintaining their father-daughter relationship. In the days that followed, Clara began her own investigation, using the skills of observation and deduction that Thaddeus himself had taught her. She started with the family correspondence, subtly examining papers when she had the chance during her lessons with Mrs. Hammond or discussions about wedding preparations. What she found chilled her and confirmed her worst fears. There was not a single letter from a cousin named Edward Langston. Instead, she found correspondence with the lawyer Phineas Crowley, discussing special arrangements and emphasizing the need for absolute discretion regarding the unusual nature of the ceremony. She also discovered bills from a portrait artist in Charleston for alterations to an existing miniature and payments to tailors for suits of clothes that seemed designed to change a man's appearance. The decisive breakthrough came when Clara discovered the safe hidden behind a bookshelf in Thaddeus's study while he was away on business in Charleston. Using a hairpin and techniques she had learned from watching the plantation locksmith, she managed to open it while the household was busy with afternoon chores, and no one would notice her presence in the study. Inside, she found the documents that laid his entire conspiracy bare, the original letters of inquiry about her parents that were never sent, the forged guardianship papers that established his power over her, the fabricated letters supposedly from the fictional cousin, and, most horrifyingly, detailed notes in Thaddeus's own hand outlining his plans for their wedding night and the years to come. But it was the marriage contract that revealed the full, terrible truth. The document, written in Crowley's meticulous legal script, was an agreement between Thaddeus Langston of Dawnland Plantation, Beaufort County, and Clara Mayfield, the legally adopted daughter of the aforementioned Thaddeus Langston. There was no mention of any cousin. The groom and the adoptive father were explicitly identified as one and the same. The truth crashed over Clara like an icy wave, leaving her trembling and nauseous as she sat in Thaddeus's chair, reading the documents that had sealed her fate with cold precision. Every kindness he had shown her, every lesson he had taught, every moment of feigned fatherly affection, had been a calculated step toward this ultimate violation. She had been manipulated since she was a child to become not just his heir, but his wife, a woman who was both daughter and bride, ensuring that the Langston line would continue while the entire estate remained under his absolute control. The most terrifying aspect of the plot was its legal sophistication and the sense of utter helplessness it created for her. By adopting her first, Thaddeus had established a legitimate line of inheritance and paternal authority over her. By marrying her second, he would maintain control of the estate, while ensuring that any children born of the union would be the indisputable, legitimate heirs to the Langston fortune. In the complex legal landscape of the time in South Carolina, where property rights were paramount and bloodlines determined everything, the arrangement was grotesque, but not necessarily illegal. Even more chilling were Thaddeus's notes on his long-term plan. He had calculated that Clara's youth and his own established position would allow them to appear as a normal couple when visiting Charleston or traveling on business away from Dawnland. The adoption papers would be kept hidden and never mentioned. The marriage certificate would list only their two names, with no mention of their prior father-daughter relationship. Their children would grow up knowing Thaddeus only as their father, never learning the truth of their mother's origins. That night, Clara lay awake, trying to devise a plan of escape. But as the first rays of dawn crept through her window, she confronted a devastating reality. She had nowhere to go and no resources. Thaddeus had been too meticulous in his isolation of her. She had no friends, no connections to any families who might help, and no money or property of her own. Even if she could prove his plot, the legal documents themselves were designed to make her look like a consenting party to the arrangement. The wedding was set for November 15th, less than a month away. Time was running out, and Thaddeus's trap was nearly perfect. Clara's opportunity came in the form of an unexpected visitor who arrived at Dawnland like an answer to a desperate prayer. One afternoon in late October, a young journalist named Nathaniel Brooks from the Charleston Gazette arrived at the plantation, requesting an interview with Thaddeus for a feature on the success of the cotton industry. His intelligent demeanor and keen, observant eyes sparked a faint glimmer of hope in Clara. Could this be her connection to the outside world? Nathaniel Brooks was a man of about 28, with tousled brown hair and sharp eyes that held the curiosity of someone who was always searching for the truth behind the facade. His attire marked him as an educated man, and his dinner conversation revealed a deep knowledge of the prominent families and business dealings in both Charleston and Savannah, knowledge that came from years of reporting on the rise and fall of Southern society. During the dinner, served in Dawnland's grand dining room beneath the portraits of the Langston ancestors, Clara listened intently as Nathaniel spoke of his travels along the coast, from Charleston to Savannah. He told stories of the bustling ports, the rising merchant families, and the challenges of reporting in a society full of well-kept secrets. When Thaddeus excused himself for a moment to give instructions to Amos Reed about an issue at the Cotton Gin, Clara seized her chance. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "May I ask if you have ever heard of a family in Savannah by the name of Mayfield? I believe they may be distant relatives of mine." The journalist's intelligent face lit up with professional interest and a hint of sympathy. "Mayfield, I do recall hearing of them. Henry and Abigail Mayfield, was it? A true tragedy. That boating accident years ago. I met them a few times at the Savannah port. They were fur traders, good people. They often spoke of their young daughter, Clara, a bright little girl they planned to take to Tennessee after concluding some business here." Clara's composure nearly broke as she heard information Thaddeus had always insisted was unknowable. "Her aunt. My aunt. What was her name?" "Mary Mayfield," Nathaniel replied. "Your mother, Abigail's sister. A formidable woman. Last I saw her, she was still managing the family shop in Savannah. She never gave up hope of hearing news about her sister's family. A terrible business, really, that they never reached their rendezvous in Tennessee. But why do you ask, Miss Langston?" Before Clara could answer, Thaddeus returned to the dining room, and the conversation immediately shifted to another topic. But Clara knew enough to confirm her worst fears and to discover that she had family, real family, still alive and looking for her. And Thaddeus's claims that she was alone in the world were just another cruel lie. That night, Clara made a bold decision, one that would require all the courage and intelligence she possessed. She would confront Thaddeus directly, not to beg for mercy or negotiate her freedom, but to force him to admit his crimes. She knew that if she could somehow get word to Nathaniel, a journalist with access to the authorities in Charleston, she might have a chance to escape the trap that had held her for 13 years. She waited until the mansion was asleep, then crept through the dark corridors to Thaddeus's study, where she knew he often worked late. She found him there as expected, reviewing the final details for their wedding, the fraudulent documents spread before him like a battle plan. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway in her white nightgown, his expression shifted from surprise to something more dangerous, a cold calculation that reminded her she was utterly alone with a murderer. "Clara," he said calmly, setting his pen on the desk, "you should be in bed. We have much to prepare for our wedding tomorrow." The possessive emphasis he placed on the word "our" sent a chill down her spine. But Clara forced herself to stand her ground. "There is no cousin Edward," she said, her voice surprisingly firm despite the terror churning inside her. "There never was. You intend to marry me yourself." Thaddeus's mask of the benevolent father finally fell away, revealing the cold-blooded predator that had always lurked beneath. The change was terrifying. There was no more pretense of affection, only the calculating gaze of a man whose plan had been discovered, but who was still utterly confident in his ability to control the situation. "You are more perceptive than I gave you credit for," he said, rising slowly to his feet. His tall frame cast long, menacing shadows in the lamplight, and Clara was suddenly aware of how physically powerless she was. "Yes, there is no cousin, and yes, in less than a month, you will become my wife. You will also remain my daughter, my heir, and the mother of the children who will carry on the Langston name. It is a perfect arrangement for everyone's benefit. Everyone's, except for mine." Clara countered, surprising herself with her own bravery in the face of imminent danger. Thaddeus's smile was as cold as the winter moon, devoid of any warmth or humanity. Your benefit is my benefit, Clara. It always has been, ever since the night I found you, orphaned and alone on the banks of the Savannah River. Did you think it was a mere accident that I rescued you? Did you think I raised you, educated you, and provided for you out of simple Christian charity? The implication in his words hit Clara like a physical blow, confirming a suspicion she had never dared to voice. The boat accident, you knew about it. I orchestrated it, Thaddeus said, with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. Your parents were foolishly boastful about the money they were carrying for their land purchase. My men were instructed to capsize the boat and take the money, but you were an unexpected prize. When I saw how much you resembled my dear Eleanor, I knew that Providence had delivered me something far more valuable than cash. The full horror of her situation coalesced in that moment. Her parents had not died in an accident. They had been murdered on Thaddeus's orders. She had been abducted, not rescued. Everything about her life for the past 13 years had been built on violence, lies, and the calculated manipulation of a child for purposes too evil to comprehend. The law will not allow this, Clara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded in a society where women had almost no rights outside the protection of men. Thaddeus's laughter was dismissive, echoing through the room filled with law books and ancestral portraits. The law, my dear, is what men like me create. Legally, you are my daughter, which means you are entirely under my authority until you are married. And then, you will be my wife, which means you will remain under my authority thereafter. The papers are all perfectly drafted, witnessed by men of standing, and filed with the court. There is no law in South Carolina or anywhere else that can touch us. He moved closer, and Clara could smell the bourbon on his breath, could see the cold satisfaction in his eyes as he savored his absolute victory. More importantly, my dear, you have nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Your dear Aunt Mary presumably believes you died with your parents 13 years ago. You have new friends, new money, new connections. Even if you were to escape Dawnland, you would be a penniless orphan with no proof of your identity and no way to survive. But Thaddeus had underestimated one crucial factor. Clara's desperation was tempered by 13 years of education and careful observation. She had learned not just literature and mathematics, but how to read people, understand their motives, and recognize their weaknesses. And she had identified Thaddeus's greatest weakness, his supreme arrogance in his own intellect. You are right, she said softly, letting a note of resignation enter her voice. I have no choice but to accept your plan, but I need to understand one thing before I resign myself to this fate. How did you know my parents would be on that river with so much money? How could you have arranged such a perfect accident? Thaddeus's expression shifted to one of proud self-satisfaction, believing her to be capitulating. Like many intelligent villains, he could not resist the urge to explain the brilliance of his scheme to someone who could appreciate its complexity. Your father was a fool, he said, leaning back in his chair with the air of a man enjoying a chance to boast. He bragged too much in the Charleston port taverns about his plans to buy land in Tennessee. It was a simple matter to learn the details of his journey, the river route they would take, and most importantly, the amount of cash they were carrying. As Thaddeus continued to gloat, detailing the months of planning that went into the murder of her parents and her own abduction, Clara carefully memorized every word. She had no weapon, no physical way to fight him, but she had something more powerful. A witness right there in the house, a journalist with a thirst for the truth and the credibility to be heard by judges and courts. What happened next became the stuff of legend, whispered throughout Beaufort County for decades to come. A tale that combined justice, vengeance, and a strange twist of fate in ways that defied easy explanation. On the morning of the 15th of November, 1825, the day of the wedding that was meant to complete Thaddeus's monstrous plan, a storm broke over Dawnland Plantation that would destroy the Langston family forever and expose the secrets that had been buried for 13 years. Clara's plan was as simple as it was devastating. Forged in 13 years of education and ultimate desperation, she had spent the final days not in resignation, but in meticulous preparation, using every skill Thaddeus had taught her. She used her knowledge of the household schedule, her access to Thaddeus's study when he was inspecting the cotton fields, and her understanding of the legal system he had used to entrap her. She had been quietly gathering the evidence of his crimes. The evidence she had compiled was extensive and damning. She had carefully copied the fraudulent guardianship papers that gave Thaddeus power over her, the fabricated letters from the non-existent cousin, the financial ledgers that documented payments for the men who had caused the Mayfield's boat to capsize, and most importantly, Thaddeus's own notes outlining his long-term plans for their marriage and the children he expected her to bear. But Clara understood that evidence alone might not be enough to bring down a man of Thaddeus's influence, wealth, and connections. She needed something more dramatic, more public, and more legally binding. She needed witnesses whose testimony could not be dismissed, and she needed to create a situation where Thaddeus's guilt was exposed in a way that could not be denied. The wedding was to take place in the grand parlor of Dawnland, with Reverend Samuel Grayson officiating and a select group of guests, including the lawyer Phineas Crowley, a few neighboring planters and their wives, local magistrates, and several prominent figures from Charleston society. To the guests, the event seemed to be a marriage between a devoted adoptive father and his daughter. Unusual, perhaps, but not unheard of in a society where property often trumped sentiment in matters of matrimony. Clara appeared in her wedding gown, an ivory silk dress that had once belonged to Thaddeus's first wife, Eleanor, altered to fit her frame. She looked pale but remarkably calm. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, adorned with the same pearls that had been Eleanor's wedding jewelry. To the guests, she was a beautiful and somewhat shy bride, perhaps overwhelmed by the gravity of the day, but resigned to her fate. Thaddeus stood beside her, dressed in his finest attire, a dark blue wool coat, an ivory waistcoat, and a perfectly tied silk cravat, all of which enhanced his air of authority. His satisfaction was evident in every gesture as he prepared to complete his masterwork. A marriage that preserved property, continued his bloodline, and maintained his social standing, all while violating every tenet of human decency. Reverend Grayson, an elderly man who had served the region's aristocratic families for over 3 decades, began the ceremony with the familiar words that had joined so many couples in South Carolina. His voice was solemn, filled with the authority of faith, as he spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the duties of husband and wife, and God's blessing on the union of 2 souls. As the ceremony proceeded with its familiar rhythm, the guests settled into the ancient ritual. It was, after all, just another plantation wedding, perhaps with unique circumstances, but following the rules they had seen 100 times. The bride was beautiful, the groom was wealthy, and the marriage would serve the practical purposes that governed most upper-class unions. Reverend Grayson reached the traditional point in the ceremony where he asked for any objections to the marriage. If any person here knows any just cause why these two should not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now, or else hereafter forever hold their peace. At that moment, Clara spoke, her voice ringing out clearly in the parlor. "I must confess a deception before God and these witnesses," she said, her words cutting through the solemn atmosphere like a sword. "I am not Thaddeus Langston's adopted daughter. I am Clara Mayfield, and this man murdered my parents, poisoned his first wife, and abducted me for the purpose you are witnessing today." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Thaddeus tried to silence her, shouting that she was suffering from bridal nerves and the fancies common to young women on the verge of marriage. But Clara had prepared for this moment with the precision of a lawyer. She produced the copied documents from his safe, handing them to Reverend Grayson and the magistrates present with a calm deliberation that made her accusations impossible to dismiss as hysteria. As the evidence was passed among men who understood the law and business ledgers, the full scope of Thaddeus's conspiracy became clear and undeniable. The fraudulent guardianship papers with their expertly forged signatures, the financial records showing payments to Amos Reed and others for special services on the Savannah River, and most damningly, the detailed notes in Thaddeus's own hand, outlining his plan to manipulate Clara from childhood, to serve this final violation. It was all there, recorded with the meticulousness of a man who never dreamed his crimes would see the light of day. But Clara had one final revelation, an accusation that would ensure Thaddeus could never escape through legal loopholes or powerful connections. "There is one more crime you must know," she announced, her voice steely despite the weight of her words. "Mr. Langston's first wife, Eleanor, did not die in a riding accident, as he has claimed for 15 years. I found her journal hidden in his safe, where she recorded her suspicions that she was being poisoned after discovering he was embezzling money from her family's trust. The accusation of wife murder, added to the evidence of Clara's abduction and her parents' murder, created a scandal that not even Thaddeus's wealth and power could contain. Several of the guests were themselves magistrates, men with the legal expertise to recognize the authenticity of the evidence Clara presented. They immediately ordered Thaddeus's arrest for investigation, despite his furious protests that it was all a misunderstanding orchestrated by a deranged young woman. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational in South Carolina's history, drawing newspaper coverage from Savannah to New York. Thaddeus attempted a defense by claiming Clara was mentally unstable, that the documents had been forged by disgruntled servants, and that the entire affair was a plot to steal his fortune. But the evidence was irrefutable. Clara's testimony was delivered with intelligence and composure, and it was backed by physical proof. Even Thaddeus's closest allies in Charleston society began to distance themselves from a man whose guilt was so apparent. The prosecution, led by Charleston's finest lawyers, painted a picture of calculated cruelty that shocked even the most jaded observers. Here was a man who had murdered 3 people for money, abducted a child, and spent 13 years manipulating her for the purpose of exploitation, all while wearing the mask of a respectable gentleman. The case became a symbol of the corruption of unchecked power and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable. Thaddeus was found guilty on multiple counts: first-degree murder for the deaths of Henry and Abigail Mayfield, kidnapping and false imprisonment of Clara, fraud and forgery, and first-degree murder for the death of his wife, Eleanor. The sentence was death by hanging, which was carried out in Charleston on the 10th of March 1826, before a crowd that included many of the powerful figures who had once vied for an invitation to a party at Dawnland. Clara used her inheritance, which was legally hers as Thaddeus's adopted daughter and the sole survivor of his crimes, to find her aunt, Mary Mayfield, in Savannah. The journey was short but emotional, and she finally found her still managing the family shop, still praying daily for news of her lost relatives. Their reunion was filled with tears and joy, but Clara carried scars that would never fade. She had survived 13 years of psychological manipulation and escaped a fate worse than death. The experience changed her forever. She had a profound understanding of the nature of evil and an iron will to prevent other children from suffering a similar fate. She never married, though she received countless proposals from men drawn to her beauty, intelligence, and vast fortune. The idea of placing herself under the control of another man was still too terrifying, too reminiscent of the trap she had fought to escape. Instead, she dedicated her life and her fortune to establishing a charity called the Radiant Moonlight, which supported abused women and children throughout South Carolina and Georgia. She built safe houses where vulnerable young people could receive an education and protection, free from exploitation by those who feigned concern. Her work became a model for social welfare, influencing the passage of new laws to protect orphans and women for decades to come. Clara died in 1887 at the age of 84, surrounded by the women and children whose lives she had saved. Her funeral was attended by social activists, politicians, and citizens from far and wide, all come to honor a woman who had turned her personal tragedy into a legacy of service to others. Dawnland Plantation was sold to cover legal debts and reparations, but the great house stood empty for years before being demolished. Local law claimed that nothing would grow properly on the land, and that on moonlit nights, the figure of a woman in a white dress could still be seen walking the fields, as a reminder of the crimes that had been buried there. The Langston name vanished completely from South Carolina society. Distant relatives changed their surnames or moved away, unable to bear the shame associated with Thaddeus's crimes. The family's position, once thought to be as solid as bedrock, had dissolved in a single generation. It was a testament to the fact that even the most respectable facades cannot hide the truth forever. Amos Reed, Thaddeus's overseer and accomplice in the murders, was tried separately and sentenced to life in prison. Phineas Crowley, the lawyer who had enabled the legal deceptions, was disbarred and served prison time for fraud and complicity. The case became a cautionary tale, cited in law schools and sermons alike, a prime example of how power and greed can fester when society fails to protect its weakest members. Clara's courage in exposing the truth, despite the risks and the power of her oppressor, became an inspiration for reformers fighting for the rights of women and children. This story shows us how cleverly evil can hide behind the veneer of respectability and social status, how the vulnerable can be exploited by the very people who claim to protect them, and how courage and intelligence can ultimately triumph over even the most sophisticated, calculated crimes. Clara Mayfield's determination to reclaim justice not only saved her own life, but stopped Thaddeus Langston from harming other victims and helped establish safeguards that would benefit countless others in the years to come. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that such intricate plots and systematic abuse could exist in the high society of the antebellum American South? Where do you think Clara found the courage to risk everything by exposing Thaddeus when she had no guarantee that anyone would believe or help her? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on how one woman's intelligence and willpower brought down a seemingly untouchable predator who hid his monstrous nature behind a veil of wealth and power. If you enjoyed this dark tale from the hidden history of South Carolina, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our weekly journeys into America's most chilling historical mysteries. And share this video with anyone who appreciates a story of courage triumphing over calculated evil. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters often wear the most civilized masks, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who dare to speak out against unspeakable injustice.